Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. They built Farnsworth House Inn on the site of an old tuberculosis sanatorium, and the architects thought they could bury the past under marble floors and Persian rugs. What they didn't count on was that some sickness runs deeper than lungs, some infections of the soul that antibiotics can't cure. The original building burned down in 1952, taking 47 patients with it. But their coughing echoes through the ventilation system every night, like a respiratory ghost haunting the ducts. I've learned to tell the difference between the living and the dead by the sound they make when they breathe. The living guests wheeze and snore and talk in their sleep. The dead ones just cough. Wet, rattling sounds that drift through the walls and settle in your chest like pneumonia made of memory. And when morning comes, I always find small drops of blood on the registration desk, as if someone spent the night coughing up their lungs one last time. My name is Jake Kowalski, and 6 months ago, I was selling insurance in Scranton, Pennsylvania, living in a studio apartment above DeGidio's Pizza on North Main Avenue. The commission checks barely covered rent, and after my divorce from Lisa, I needed something that would put distance between me and the wreckage of my old life. When I saw the job posting for night clerk at Farnsworth House Inn in Gettysburg, the salary seemed too good to be true. 3 times what I was making plus room and board. I should have known better. In my experience, when something sounds too good to be true, it usually comes with a catch that'll eat you alive. The inn sits on Baltimore Street, close enough to the battlefield that tourists love the historic atmosphere, but far enough from the main drag that most people drive past without noticing. From the outside, it looks like any other Victorian bed and breakfast. Cream-colored siding, wrap-around porch, flower boxes that someone actually tends to. The inside tells a different story, if you know how to read the signs. The hardwood floors creak in patterns that spell out words in Morse code. The wallpaper in the hallways has tiny holes punched through it, each one perfectly round, like someone pressed cigarettes against the surface until they burned through. And in the basement, behind the modern furnace and water heater, you can still see portions of the original foundation. Limestone blocks, stained rust brown, with what the previous owner assured me was just iron deposits from groundwater. My first week here, I thought the job would be simple. Check in late arrivals, handle any guest emergencies, keep the coffee pot brewing in the lobby. The inn rarely books more than half its rooms, even during peak tourist season, so most nights I figured I'd be reading paperbacks and watching Netflix until dawn. Then Mrs. Henley, the day manager, handed me a folded piece of paper on my 8th night and told me these weren't suggestions. They were survival instructions. She said the last night clerk ignored them, and they found him in room 47 3 days later, his lungs filled with fluid that tested positive for tuberculosis bacteria that had been extinct for 70 years. That's when I learned about the rules. Mrs. Henley waited until the last day guest checked out before approaching my desk. She was a thin woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent expression of concern. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded the paper, not from age, but from something deeper, like her bones remembered being afraid. "Jake, honey, I need you to memorize these tonight. Don't write them down anywhere else. Don't take pictures. Don't even think about them too hard during daylight hours. Some things in this place feed on attention." The paper felt wrong against my fingers, rougher than it should have been, like sandpaper disguised as stationery. 8 rules were typed in courier font, each one numbered and precise. 1. never acknowledge the woman in the white nightgown who walks the second-floor hallway between 2:17 and 2:23 a.m. She died coughing up blood in 1951 and still believes she's looking for the nurse's station. 2. If you hear children singing "Ring Around the Rosie" from the basement, turn the lobby radio to 104.7 FM immediately. The static will drown them out before they reach the third verse. Third, room 23 must remain locked after midnight. The previous guest never checked out, and he becomes agitated when disturbed. 4. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., check the registration book every 15 minutes. If you find names written in red ink that weren't there before, cross them out with a black pen. Do not read them aloud. 5. The elevator operates on its own schedule after midnight. If it stops on the 4th floor and opens without being called, do not look inside. Wait for the doors to close and continue your rounds. 6. Keep a bowl of salt water on the front desk. Replace it at dawn. If it turns pink during the night, someone is bleeding somewhere in the building. 7. Answer the payphone in the lobby if it rings between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m., but hang up immediately if you hear breathing. That sounds like drowning. 8. Before sunrise, check every guest room door for scratch marks. If you find fresh gouges in the wood, slide a blessed medallion under the door and notify Mrs. Hemley immediately. "Where do I get blessed medallions?" I asked. Mrs. Hemley reached into her purse and handed me a small cloth bag that clinked softly. "Father Murphy at St. Francis Xavier blesses a batch every month. These should last you a while, God willing." My first night alone started quietly. The inn had only 3 occupied rooms. A retired couple from Baltimore in room 15, a traveling salesman in room 9, and a graduate student researching Civil War medical practices in room 31. Normal people doing normal things, or so I hoped. At 2:15 a.m., I positioned myself at the front desk with a clear view of the main staircase. The registration book lay open beside me, a black pen ready in my right hand. The salt water in Mrs. Hemley's ceramic bowl reflected the lobby's chandelier like a tiny mirror. 2 minutes later, she appeared. The woman materialized at the top of the stairs, wearing a nightgown that might have been white once, but now carried the yellow stains of decades. Her feet made no sound on the wooden steps, but I could hear her breathing, or what passed for breathing. Each inhalation whistled through holes that shouldn't exist, and each exhalation sprayed fine droplets of moisture that caught the light like morning dew. She moved down the hallway with purpose, checking doorknobs, pressing her ear against each door as if listening for something specific. Her hair hung in wet strands around her face, and when she turned toward the staircase, I saw the dark stains spreading across the front of her nightgown like spilled wine. Every instinct told me to call out, to ask if she needed help, to acknowledge her presence somehow. Instead, I focused on the registration book, running my finger along the margins, counting the entries from earlier that day. The woman passed directly in front of the desk, close enough that I should have felt body heat or caught a scent of perfume or soap. Instead, the air turned cold and damp, like standing inside a refrigerated morgue. At exactly 2:23, she faded away, dissolving like sugar in hot coffee until only the memory of her remained. I checked my watch and exhaled slowly. 6 minutes. Rule number 1 complete. The next few hours passed without incident. I made coffee, updated the guest log, and even managed to read 2 chapters of a Stephen King novel I'd found in the break room. Around 3:45 a.m., I heard the elevator tables moving. The brass needle above the elevator door climbed from the lobby level to the 2nd floor, then the 3rd, then stopped at 4. The mechanism hummed for several seconds before going silent. Then the doors opened. I kept my eyes fixed on the registration book. But peripheral vision is a cruel thing. Even without looking directly, I could see the soft yellow glow spilling from the elevator car, and I could hear something moving inside. Not footsteps, but a wet dragging sound, like someone pulling the heavy sack across linoleum. The smell hit me next. Antiseptic mixed with decay. Medicine cabinet contents gone sour. The particular odor of sickness that clings to hospital rooms and refuses to leave even after the patient is gone. The doors stayed open for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 30 seconds. When they finally closed, the elevator descended to the basement level and stayed there for the rest of the night. At 4:15 a.m., I found the first entry written in red ink. The name appeared between the entries for Mr. Davidson in room 9 and the graduate student in room 31, written in handwriting that belonged to no living person I'd ever met. The ink looked fresh, still wet enough to smear if I touched it, but the paper around it had already begun to yellow at the edges. Margaret Whitmore, room 47, tuberculosis ward. My pen trembled as I drew a thick black line through the entry. The ink seemed to resist, fighting back like it had a will of its own, but eventually the name disappeared under my strokes. As soon as I finished, the temperature in the lobby dropped 10 degrees, and somewhere above me, a door slammed hard enough to rattle the chandelier. I checked my watch. 4:22 a.m. According to Rule 4, I had 13 minutes before my next mandatory check of the registration book. The graduate student appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing boxer shorts and a Penn State t-shirt that had seen better decades. His name was Tommy Kellerman, according to the check-in register, and his dissertation focused on amputation techniques during the Battle of Gettysburg. He looked like the kind of guy who spent most of his time in library basements, pale and thin with wire-rimmed glasses that reflected the lobby lighting. "Excuse me," he called down, "but is there construction going on upstairs?" "Someone's been hammering on the walls for the past hour." I glanced at the guest roster. Nobody else was staying on the 3rd floor, and room 47, where they'd found the previous night clerk, sat directly above Tommy's room. "Sorry about that, Mr. Kellerman." "I'll check on it right away. Old building. You know how the pipes can be." Tommy nodded and disappeared back down the hallway. I waited until I heard his door close before grabbing the flashlight from behind the desk and heading upstairs. The 3rd floor hallway stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors that all looked identical, except for their brass numbers. Room 47 sat at the far end, and as I approached, I could see fresh gouges in the wood around the lock, like someone had been clawing at it from the inside. The scratches were deep enough to splinter the wood, forming patterns that almost looked like letters if you squinted in the right light. I pulled out my phone and used the camera flash to get a better look. "Let me out. Can't breathe. So cold." The words repeated in scratchy, desperate script, carved over and over until they overlapped into a tangle of wood shavings in rage. I reached into my pocket for one of Father Murphy's medallions and slid it under the door. The hammering stopped immediately. Back in the lobby, I added room 47, fresh scratches, medallion deployed to my incident log, and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking. The registration book showed 4:34 a.m., still within my 15-minute window, but I checked it anyway. 2 new names had appeared, both in that same red ink. James Bradley, room 12, consumption. Sarah Beth Mills, room 33, chronic pneumonia. I crossed them out with growing unease. Room 12 had been empty for 3 days, and room 33 didn't exist. The inn only went up to room 31 on each floor. But the dead don't follow the same architectural rules as the living, and they certainly don't respect occupancy limits. The payphone rang at 4:47 a.m. The sound cut through the lobby like a fire alarm, sharp and insistent. I'd been dreading this moment since reading Rule 7, but hearing the actual ring made my stomach clench like a fist. Old rotary phones have a particular sound, not the electronic chirp of modern devices, but a real bell being struck by a real hammer, mechanical and urgent. I picked up the handset on the third ring. "Farnsworth House Inn, this is Jake." Breathing filled the line immediately, but not the kind you'd hear from a living person. This sounded like someone trying to inhale while underwater, each breath a struggle against fluid that shouldn't be there. Wet, desperate gasps that spoke of lungs full of drowning. I hung up before the sound could burrow deeper into my brain. The phone rang again 30 seconds later. This time I answered and hung up immediately, not giving whatever was on the other end a chance to breathe at me. The pattern continued for the next hour. Ring, answer, hang up, repeat. By the sixth call, I started recognizing variations in the breathing pattern, like different people were taking turns trying to speak through drowned lungs. At 5:15 a.m., the call stopped. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but I could feel the night beginning to loosen its grip on the building. The shadows in the corners seemed less dense, and the air conditioning kicked on for the first time since midnight, circulating fresh air through vents that had been silent all night. I checked the saltwater bowl and found it had turned a pale pink, like someone had mixed watercolor paint with the liquid. According to Rule 6, this meant someone was bleeding somewhere in the building. The bowl sat next to the registration book, reflecting the chandelier light in tiny waves that made the pink color shift and swirl. Tommy Kellerman appeared at the desk again, this time fully dressed and carrying a laptop bag. "I'm checking out early," he said. "Something about this place doesn't agree with me." "Was it the noise upstairs?" "Because I took care of that." Tommy shook his head and placed his keycard on the desk. "It's not the noise, man. It's the dreams. All night long, I kept dreaming about being in a hospital ward, surrounded by people who couldn't stop coughing. And when I woke up, I had this." He pulled up his t-shirt to reveal a series of small, round bruises across his chest and back, each one perfectly circular and dark purple at the center. I'd seen marks like that before, in medical textbooks from my brief stint as a pre-med student. They were called cupping marks, circular bruises left by glass cups used to draw blood and other fluids from tuberculosis patients in the early 1900s. The treatment was considered cutting edge at the time, though it probably killed more patients than it cured. "Did you visit any historical sites yesterday?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Sometimes people have allergic reactions to old buildings, dust mites, that sort of thing." "No, nothing like that. I spent the whole day in the Adams County Historical Society, reading documents about battlefield medicine, but these marks weren't here when I went to bed." Tommy hefted his laptop bag over his shoulder. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble, but something weird is happening in this place. Maybe you should think about finding another job." After he left, I walked through the building doing my final rounds. The retired couple from Baltimore was still asleep in room 15, their gentle snoring audible through the door. Room 9 stood empty and clean, ready for the next guest, and room 47 remained locked, though I could swear I heard faint scratching sounds when I pressed my ear to the wood. The registration book showed one final entry when I returned to the lobby. "Thomas Kellerman, room 31, occupational exposure." But Tommy had already checked out. His keycard sat on the desk where he'd left it, and I'd watched him drive away in his Honda Accord 20 minutes earlier. This time, the red ink entry wouldn't cross out. My pen skipped across the surface, like it was writing on glass, leaving no mark no matter how hard I pressed. Outside, the first hints of sunrise began to creep across Baltimore Street. But inside the Farnsworth House Inn, the night was far from over. The pink salt water kept getting darker. By 5:30 a.m., what had started as a pale blush now looked like watered-down cherry juice, and tiny bubbles were forming around the rim of the bowl. I'd replaced it twice already, but each fresh bowl turned the same color within minutes, as if something in the building was bleeding faster than I could dilute it. I grabbed my flashlight and incident log, determined to find a source before Mrs. Hemley arrived at 7. The bleeding could be something simple. A guest with a nosebleed, or maybe the old plumbing had finally given up and started leaking rust water. But the rational explanations felt thin in a place where dead tuberculosis patients scratched messages into doors and former guests called from payphones using drowned lungs. The second floor seemed normal enough. I checked each occupied room by pressing my ear to the door, listening for sounds of distress or injury. The retired couple from Baltimore, George and Patricia Hoffman, according to their registration, were still sleeping peacefully. Their breathing sounded healthy, no wet rattles or concerning wheeze. Room 9 remained empty, but when I tested the doorknob, it turned easily. That was wrong. Policy required all unoccupied rooms to stay locked, and I distinctly remembered seeing the housekeeping staff secure it after Tommy's departure. Inside, the room looked exactly as it should. Queen bed with white linens, antique writing desk, reproduction Civil War-era photographs on the walls. But the air felt different, thicker somehow, like breathing through wet cloth. And there, on the pillowcase where a guest's head would rest, was a dark stain about the size of a silver dollar. I approached the bed carefully, flashlight beam dancing across the fabric. The stain was definitely blood, fresh enough to still feel damp when I touched it with a pen from my pocket. But more troubling were the smaller droplets scattered across the white sheets, forming a pattern that suggested someone had been coughing violently while lying down. Tommy Kellerman had checked out hours ago. I'd watched him drive away myself. A sound from the basement interrupted my investigation, faint at first but growing stronger. Children's voices, high and sweet, drifting up through the old ventilation system like smoke from a chimney. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. I ran for the lobby, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Rule 2 was specific. Turn the radio to 104.7 FM before they reached the third verse. The singing grew louder as I fumbled with the old Zenith radio behind the front desk, static crackling through the speakers as I spun the dial. We all fall down. The children's chorus echoed through the building now, not just from the basement, but from every air vent, every wall cavity, every space where sound could travel. Their voices layered over each other in harmonies that human throats shouldn't be able to produce, creating chords that made my teeth ache. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. My fingers found 104.7 just as they started the second verse. Static flooded the lobby, white noise that cut through the singing like a chainsaw through silk. The children's voices fought back, trying to break through the electronic hiss, but the radio held them at bay. I kept the volume high until the building fell silent again. The registration book had 3 new entries when I checked it at 5:45 a.m. Emily Chen, room 15, pediatric tuberculosis. Michael O'Brien, room 23, advanced consumption. David Kowalski, room 47, acute respiratory failure. The last name made my stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables. Kowalski was my surname, and David was my middle name, David Jake Kowalski, according to my birth certificate and driver's license. But I was standing in the lobby, very much alive, crossing out names with a black pen that seemed to grow heavier with each stroke. The entry for room 23 bothered me almost as much. According to Rule 3, that room stayed locked after midnight because the previous guest never checked out. but Michael O'Brien suggested the occupant had a name, a history, maybe even a story about how he'd ended up trapped in a bed and breakfast room for eternity. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. The second-floor hallway stretched ahead of me like a tunnel, dimly lit by sconces that cast more shadow than light. Room 23 sat halfway down the corridor, distinguishable from the others only by the absence of any decoration around its doorframe. No welcome mat, no seasonal wreath, no small placard with historical information about the room's original purpose. I pressed my ear to the wood and listened. Breathing. Slow, labored, painful breathing that spoke of lungs filled with fluid and infection. Each inhalation sounded like drowning in reverse, air struggling to find space in airways clogged with disease. And underneath that, barely audible, was the sound of someone tapping against the inside of the door. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Morse code. 3 short, 4 short, 3 short. SOS. The tapping continued, urgent and desperate, while the breathing grew more ragged. Whoever was inside room 23 was suffocating, drowning in their own infected lungs, and they wanted out. I reached for the doorknob before catching myself. Rule 3 was clear. The room stayed locked after midnight, and the previous guest became agitated when disturbed. But listening to someone die behind a door, even someone who might already be dead, felt like the worst kind of cowardice. "Michael?" I whispered through the wood. "Michael O'Brien?" The tapping stopped immediately. Then, in a voice like gravel mixed with broken glass, "Help me." I stepped back from the door so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. The breathing inside the room had changed, becoming more excited, more aware. Whatever was in room 23 knew I was there, and it wanted something from me. "I can't open the door," I said, feeling ridiculous for talking to a possibly dead tuberculosis patient. "The rules say?" "Rules." The voice coughed, and I heard liquid hitting the floor inside the room. "Made to be broken." My hand moved toward the doorknob again, almost without conscious thought. The metal felt warm under my fingers, like someone was gripping it from the other side, and I could feel a slight vibration through the brass, as if a heart was beating somewhere inside the mechanism. The payphone rang downstairs, breaking the spell. I jerked my hand away from the doorknob and ran for the lobby, leaving Michael O'Brien or whatever he'd become to tap out his distress signals in the dark. The phone was already on its 4th ring when I reached it. Farnsworth House Inn. This time, instead of drowning breath, I heard words, faint and distorted, like someone talking through water, but definitely human speech. "Jake Kowalski." The line went dead. I stared at the handset for a long moment before hanging up. Nobody knew I worked here except Mrs. Henley, and she wouldn't be calling at 6 in the morning. But somehow, whatever was using the payphone knew my name. The salt water bowl had turned completely red. Not pink, not rose-colored, but the deep crimson of fresh blood straight from an artery. And as I watched, the level began to rise, as if an invisible source was adding more liquid drop by drop. I dumped the bowl in the utility sink and refilled it with fresh water and salt, but within seconds it had turned red again. The bleeding was getting worse, and I was running out of time to find the source before Mrs. Henley arrived and started asking questions I couldn't answer. That's when I noticed the drops on the registration desk. Small, perfectly round droplets of blood, scattered across the surface like someone had been standing there coughing up their lungs. They formed a trail leading from the desk to the staircase, then up to the 2nd floor, I followed the trail with my flashlight, counting drops as I climbed. 17 on the stairs, 12 more down the hallway, and then a larger puddle outside room 47. The scratches in the door had gotten deeper since my last visit, carved so far into the wood that I could see splinters on the hallway carpet. But now there were new words mixed in with the desperate pleas. Jake Kowalski. Room 47. Your turn. The blood trail ended directly in front of the door, as if whoever had been bleeding had finally stopped moving, or stopped breathing. I knelt and touched one of the drops with my pen tip, still wet, still warm. Behind the door, something wafted. Not the wet, painful sound I'd heard from room 23, but genuine amusement, like someone had just heard the funniest joke in the world. Found you, a voice whispered through the keyhole. The laugh grew louder, echoing through the building like a song. I backed away from room 47 as the laughter grew stronger, echoing through the walls like water through pipes. My flashlight beam wavered across the blood trail, and I realized the drops were still falling, not from some unseen wound, but from the ceiling above, seeping through plaster and paint, like the building itself was bleeding. The elevator cables started moving again. This time I didn't look at the brass indicator needle. I kept my eyes focused on my shoes, counting the scuff marks on the leather, while the mechanism hummed and clicked. The car rose past the second floor, past the third, stopping at the fourth floor that technically didn't exist. When the doors opened, the smell of antiseptic and decay flooded the hallway so strongly that I had to cover my nose with my shirt sleeve. But worse than the smell was the sound. Dozens of people breathing with diseased lungs, wheezing and rattling in harmony like a choir of the dying. Something dragged itself out of the elevator car and onto the fourth floor that shouldn't be there. I ran for the staircase, taking the steps down to the lobby 3 at a time. My incident log fell from my pocket and scattered papers across the hardwood floor. But I didn't stop to collect them. The registration book lay open on the front desk, and I could see new entries appearing even as I watched. Red ink bleeding across the page like wounds opening in the paper itself. Margaret Whitmore, room 47, tuberculosis ward. James Bradley, room 12, consumption. Sarah Beth Mills, room 33, chronic pneumonia. Emily Chen, room 15, pediatric tuberculosis. Michael O'Brien, room 23, advanced consumption. David Kowalski, room 47, acute respiratory failure. The same names over and over, filling page after page of the registration book. But now they were appearing faster than I could cross them out, and my black pen was running out of ink. I grabbed a fresh pen from the supply drawer and started crossing out entries. But for every name I eliminated, 2 more appeared. The red ink seemed to have a life of its own, flowing across the pages in handwriting that belonged to people who'd been dead for 70 years. The payphone rang again. This time I let it ring while I worked, focusing on the growing list of phantom guests who wanted to check into rooms that either didn't exist or should have remained empty. But the ringing continued, shrill and insistent, until I couldn't ignore it anymore. Farnsworth House Inn. Jake. The voice was clearer now, less distorted by water and death. You can't cross us out. Forever. Who is this? We're waiting for you in room 47. Your reservation has been confirmed. The line went dead, but the dial tone that followed sounded wrong. Not the steady electronic hum of a modern phone system, but the hollow echo you'd hear if you put your ear to an empty oil drum. I hung up and checked the salt water bowl. The liquid had turned so dark, it looked like motor oil, and small particles were floating on the surface. bits of tissue and blood clots that shouldn't exist in a bowl of salt water. I dumped it again and refilled it with fresh supplies, but the new water turned black within seconds. Somewhere in the building, someone was bleeding to death. The woman in the white nightgown appeared at the top of the stairs right on schedule, 2:17 a.m., according to my watch. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a line of figures in hospital gowns and pajamas, each one moving with the shuffling gait of the terminally ill. Men, women, children, all of them coughing, all of them leaving wet footprints on the hardwood stairs. I kept my eyes fixed on the registration book, crossing out names as fast as they appeared, but I could hear them moving through the lobby. Bare feet on wooden floors, the rustle of cotton fabric, and that constant liquid coughing that spoke of lungs drowning in their own fluids. They passed by the front desk in single file, close enough that I should have felt body heat or caught a scent of soap or medicine. Instead, the air grew colder with each passing figure, and drops of moisture began forming on the surface of the registration book, making the ink run and blur. At exactly 2:23, they faded away, leaving only damp footprints and the lingering smell of tuberculosis wards. But the registration book kept filling with names. Thomas Kellerman, room 31, occupational exposure. Tommy's entry appeared again, written in the same red ink despite the fact that he'd checked out hours ago and driven back to Penn State. I tried to cross it out, but the ink wouldn't take. My pen skipped across the surface like I was writing on glass. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every name in red ink belonged to someone who died of tuberculosis or lung-related illness, except for Tommy Kellerman and David Kowalski. We were still alive, still breathing, still walking around with healthy lungs that could process oxygen without drowning in fluid. The dead guests weren't trying to check in. They were making reservations for the living. I grabbed my cell phone and called Tommy's number, hoping he'd made it safely back to campus. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail, but instead of Tommy's recorded greeting, I heard wet, labored breathing followed by a voice I didn't recognize. Tommy can't come to the phone right now. He's coughing up something important. I hung up and immediately dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I need you to do a welfare check on Thomas Kellerman at Penn State University. He stayed at the Farnsworth house last night and might be in medical distress. Can you describe the nature of the medical emergency, sir? How do you explain to a 911 operator that a tuberculosis sanitarium from the 1950s is infecting college students through supernatural means? How do you tell them that dead patients are making reservations for the living in a registration book that writes itself? Possible respiratory illness, I said finally. He was exposed to contaminated air. I'll dispatch units to check on him, sir. Can I get your name and location? I gave them the information and hung up, knowing that by the time they found Tommy, it would probably be too late. Whatever had happened to the previous night clerk was happening to him now, and maybe to me as well. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor. I hadn't heard the cables moving this time, hadn't seen the brass needle climb to indicate the car's position. The doors simply opened, revealing the interior I'd been instructed never to look at when it stopped at the 4th floor. But this wasn't the 4th floor. This was the lobby level, and Rule 5 said nothing about avoiding the elevator when it operated on the ground floor. Inside, the car was filled with hospital beds. Not modern beds with electronic controls and plastic safety rails, but the old iron-framed beds from tuberculosis wards, complete with thin mattresses and white sheets stained with decades of bodily fluids. And in each bed lay a patient, some young, some old, all of them coughing with the wet rattle of diseased lungs. In the bed closest to the door, a man in his 50s raised his head and looked directly at me. His face was gaunt and pale, with the hollow cheeks of someone who'd been sick for months, but his eyes were bright with fever and recognition. "Room 47 is ready for you now, Mr. Kowalski," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own labored breathing. "We've been keeping it warm." The elevator doors began to close, but not before I saw him smile. The kind of smile you see on the faces of people who know something you don't, who've been let in on a secret that's both wonderful and terrible. The doors sealed shut with a soft thud, and the elevator climbed toward the fourth floor that didn't exist, carrying its cargo of dead patients to whatever ward they'd built in the space between reality and memory. My watch showed 6:15 a.m., less than an hour until Mrs. Henley arrived for the day shift. The registration book had one final entry, written in red ink that looked fresh enough to still be wet. Jake Kowalski, room 47, acute respiratory failure, checking in at dawn. I slammed the registration book shut and shoved it into the desk drawer, as if hiding the evidence could somehow cancel my reservation with death. The red ink had already begun seeping through the pages, staining my fingers when I touched the cover, and I could feel something warm and wet spreading under my fingernails. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Your room is ready. Check-in begins at sunrise." I deleted the message, but another appeared immediately. "Housekeeping has prepared fresh linens. You'll find them comfortable." Then another. "The previous guest left early. He's waiting to show you around." I turned off the phone and threw it in the drawer with the registration book, but the screen kept lighting up through the wood, casting red shadows across the lobby like emergency lighting in a hospital corridor. The saltwater bowl had started bubbling. Not the gentle fizzing of carbonation, but violent eruptions that sent dark liquid spattering across the desk's surface. Each bubble carried bits of organic matter, pieces of lung tissue, blood clots, fragments of things that belonged inside human bodies, not floating in bowls of salt water. I needed to get out of the building. The rational part of my brain knew I should walk outside, get in my car, and drive away from Gettysburg as fast as the speed limit would allow. Let Mrs. Henley find an empty lobby and figure out what happened to her night clerk. Let someone else deal with supernatural tuberculosis patients and rooms that existed in architectural spaces that defied logic. But when I reached for the front door, the handle wouldn't turn. The deadbolt was unlocked. The security chain hung loose, and I could see my Honda Civic parked in the lot through the glass panels. But the brass handle felt frozen in place, as if someone had welded it to the door frame while I wasn't looking. I threw my shoulder against the door, then tried the windows. Same result. Everything sealed tight, turned into decorative features rather than functional exits. The building had decided I wasn't leaving until my reservation was complete. That's when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the shuffling gait of tuberculosis patients this time, but purposeful steps that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going. I grabbed my flashlight and positioned myself behind the front desk, using the solid oak as a barrier between me and whatever was coming down from the upper floors. Tommy Kellerman appeared at the bottom of the staircase. But this wasn't the nervous graduate student who'd checked out 6 hours earlier. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that made the veins visible beneath the surface, and his breathing produced the wet rattle I'd been hearing all night. Dark stains spread across the front of his Penn State shirt, and when he smiled, his teeth were pink with blood. "Jake," he said, his voice carrying that underwater quality I'd heard through the payphone. "They sent me to get you. Room 47 is ready." "You left," I said, backing toward the utility closet where Mrs. Henley kept the cleaning supplies. "I watched you drive away." I tried to leave. Tommy coughed, spraying droplets of red across the hardwood floor. Made it about 10 miles before I started feeling sick. Pulled over at a rest stop on Route 15, and that's when I started coughing up blood. Lots of blood. More than should fit inside a person. He moved closer, and I could see the circular bruises on his arms had spread, covering his skin like purple coins pressed into flesh. The cupping marks weren't just bruises anymore. They were actual wounds, small circular holes that went straight through to whatever was underneath. The paramedics brought me back here, Tommy continued, seemingly unaware that holes had opened in his arms. Said this was the only place equipped to handle my condition. Isn't that thoughtful? They have just the right room for me. You're dead, I said, though saying it out loud felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Tommy laughed, the sound mixing with the fluid in his lungs to create a noise like water going down a drain. Death is just a change of accommodations, Jake. Room 31 was temporary housing. Room 47 is more permanent. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a brass key, the metal tarnished black with age. They gave me this when I checked back in. It opens all the doors now, the ones that exist and the ones that don't. Would you like to see the 4th floor? It's got an amazing view of the tuberculosis ward. I edged toward the utility closet, hoping to find something that could be used as a weapon. But what do you use to fight someone who's already dead? Holy water? A cross? Salt? Mrs. Hemley had never mentioned a protocol for dealing with deceased guests who insisted on staying past checkout time. The others are waiting, Tommy said, inserting the brass key into a lock that didn't exist on the front desk. The wood grains split apart to reveal a keyhole that belonged to a door from 1951, complete with the original manufacturer's stamp. Margaret wants to show you where she keeps her lungs. Michael has been practicing his breathing exercises, and the children in the basement learned a new song. As if summoned by his words, voices drifted up from below. London Bridge is falling down. Falling down. Falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady. But the melody was wrong, twisted into minor keys that made the innocent children's song sound like a funeral dirge. And instead of London Bridge, they were singing something else. Room 47's calling out, calling out, calling out. Room 47's calling out. Come and die here. I lunged for the utility closet and grabbed the first thing my hands found, a bottle of industrial bleach that Mrs. Hemley used to sanitize the guest bathrooms. Tommy watched with amusement as I brandished the plastic container like a sword. That won't help, he said. We're not germs, Jake. We're guests, and guests have rights. He turned the brass key in the phantom lock, and the front desk began to change. The modern oak surface aged decades in seconds, developing the scratches and stains of a hospital admissions desk from the 1950s. Metal file cabinets materialized beside it, filled with patient records written in fountain pen ink on yellowed paper. The lobby transformed around us, modern carpet giving way to checkerboard linoleum, electric lighting replaced by harsh fluorescent tubes that buzzed and flickered. The comfortable seating areas became rows of wooden benches where people waited to be admitted to the tuberculosis ward. And sitting on those benches were the dead patients, all of them watching me with expressions of patient expectation. Welcome to Farnsworth Sanatorium, Tommy said, gesturing toward the assembled crowd of the diseased and deceased. We've been expecting you, Mr. Kowalski. Your admission papers were filed months ago. A woman in a nurse's uniform that had gone out of style before I was born approached the desk carrying a clipboard. Her face was hollow and pale, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many night shifts spent watching people die. When she smiled, her teeth were stained brown with old blood. David Jake Kowalski, she read from the clipboard, age 28, Admitted for observation and treatment of acute respiratory failure. Room assignment, 47. Duration of stay, permanent. She handed me a patient bracelet made of paper and string, the kind they used before plastic wristbands were invented. My name was written on it in red ink that looked suspiciously fresh. "I'm not sick," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I noticed my breath was starting to fog in the suddenly cold air. "Everyone says that when they first arrive," the nurse replied, "but the coughing always starts eventually, usually within the first few hours of admission." As if her words were a trigger, I felt a tickle on the back of my throat. Just a minor irritation, the kind you get from breathing dusty air or talking too much. I swallowed hard, trying to suppress it, but the sensation grew stronger. I coughed once, a small, dry sound that wouldn't have been concerning under normal circumstances. The dead patients applauded. "Excellent," said the nurse, making a note on her clipboard. "Right on schedule. The infection is taking hold nicely." I coughed again, this time producing a small amount of clear phlegm. Nothing alarming, just the kind of minor respiratory response you'd expect from someone who'd been breathing old building air all night. But when I looked at the tissue I'd used, there was a tiny spot of red in the center. "Stage 1, Tommy announced to the assembled patients. "The hemorrhaging has begun." The dead crowd murmured their approval, and several of them began sharing stories about their own first symptoms. How the blood had started as just a few flecks, then gradually increased until they were coughing up cupfuls of it. How the fever had followed, then the night sweats, then the slow drowning sensation as fluid filled their lungs. The treatment back then was quite primitive, explained a man in a bathrobe who looked like he'd been dead for decades. Lots of fresh air, bed rest, and procedures that probably killed more patients than they cured. But don't worry, we've learned so much since then. The dotting process is much more efficient now. I felt another cough building in my chest, deeper this time, carrying more weight. When it emerged, it brought with it a mouthful of red that tasted like copper pennies and fear. "Stage 2, the nurse noted. "Progression is excellent. You should be ready for room assignment within the hour." The building shuddered around us, walls shifting and reconfiguring, as the modern inn continued its transformation back into the tuberculosis sanatorium it had once been. Doors appeared where walls used to be, revealing glimpses of hospital wards filled with iron beds and medical equipment from the 1950s. And from one of those doors, the one marked with a brass number 47, came the sound of someone calling my name. "Jake." The voice wheezed through diseased lungs. "Your bed is ready. We've been keeping it warm for you." I looked at my watch. 6:45 a.m. 15 minutes until Mrs. Henley arrived for the day shift. 15 minutes until sunrise. 15 minutes until my reservation was confirmed. The nurse took my arm with fingers that felt like ice-covered bone, guiding me toward the door marked 47. Each step sent vibrations through the linoleum floor, and I could hear my heartbeat echoing through the building's ventilation system like a drum in an empty church. "The transition is always difficult," she said, her voice carrying the professional sympathy of someone who'd guided hundreds of patients toward their final accommodations. "But once you're settled in your room, you'll find the dying process quite peaceful. Most of our long-term residents barely notice when their breathing stops." I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened until I could feel my circulation being cut off. The coughing fit that followed brought up more blood. Not just flecks now, but actual clots that hit the floor with wet splashes. "Excellent progress," she noted on her clipboard. "Stage 3 hemorrhaging ahead of schedule. Dr. Morrison will be pleased." "There is no Dr. Morrison," I gasped between coughs. "This isn't 1951. The sanatorium burned down." The nurse smiled with lips that had been blue from oxygen deprivation for 7 decades. "Time works differently when you're dying, Mr. Kowalski. Past, present, and future all blend together like blood and water. Dr. Morrison is waiting for you in room 47, just as he waited for all the others." We passed through corridors that hadn't existed minutes earlier, each one lined with doors that bore the names of patients who died before I was born. Some doors stood open, revealing glimpses of iron hospital beds and medical equipment that belonged in museums. Others remained closed, though I could hear sounds from within: coughing, wheezing, the occasional moan of someone in the final stages of respiratory failure. Tommy Kellerman walked beside us, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of being alive. The holes in his arms had widened into tunnels that went straight through to the other side, and when he moved, I could see the wall behind him through the spaces where his organs used to be. "Room 31 was just a temporary assignment," he explained, seemingly unaware that his body was more gap than substance. "A holding area while they prepared your permanent accommodation. But room 47 is special. It's where they keep the night clerks. Better amenities, private bathroom, and an excellent view of the crematorium courtyard." The hallway stretched longer with each step, growing darker despite the buzzing fluorescent tubes overhead. The air grew thicker, more humid, carrying the smell of tuberculosis wards and disinfectant that had failed to prevent the spread of disease. My lungs worked harder to process each breath, and I could feel fluid beginning to accumulate in the spaces where air should go. "Almost there," the nurse said cheerfully. "Room 47 has been specially prepared for your arrival. Fresh sheets, clean pillowcase, and a bedside table with all the medicine you'll need for your final weeks." The door appeared at the end of the corridor, brass number 47 gleaming despite decades of tarnish. Unlike the other doors we'd passed, this one looked modern, the same style as the renovated inn rather than the 1950s sanatorium. It was a reminder that somewhere underneath the supernatural overlay, the real world still existed. But when the nurse inserted her skeleton key into the lock, the door opened on something that definitely wasn't part of any bed and breakfast. Room 47 was a hospital room from 1951, complete with an iron-framed bed, a rolling cart of medical instruments, and windows that looked out onto a courtyard filled with wheelchairs and oxygen tanks. The walls were painted that particular shade of institutional green that was supposed to be common, but instead suggested nausea and decay. And lying in the bed, propped up on pillows stained brown with dried blood, was the previous night clerk. He looked exactly like the job description had warned: lungs filled with fluid that tested positive for tuberculosis bacteria that had been extinct for 70 years. His chest rose and fell in the shallow, rapid pattern of someone whose respiratory system was failing, and each breath produced a wet rattle that spoke of organs drowning in their own secretions. "Jake," he wheezed, turning his head toward the door. "Welcome to the night shift. I've been keeping your bed warm." The nurse consulted her clipboard. "Mr. Patterson has been our longest-staying night clerk. 6 months of excellent patient compliance. He's made wonderful progress toward his final discharge." Patterson coughed, spraying red droplets across the white sheets. "The rules were supposed to protect me. Follow the procedures, survive until dawn, collect your paycheck and benefits. But they never told me that some jobs follow you home." "The employment contract was quite clear," said a new voice from the corner of the room. A man in a white coat that had yellowed with age stepped into view, carrying a medical bag that belonged in a Civil War museum. His name tag read Dr. Morrison, and his eyes held the tired compassion of someone who'd spent decades watching patients die despite his best efforts. Both night clerk positions come with comprehensive health insurance, he continued, pulling a stethoscope from his bag. Full coverage for respiratory ailments, including experimental treatments unavailable in the outside world. Mr. Patterson has received excellent care during his extended stay. Patterson laughed, the sound mixing with lung fluid to create something between humor and drowning. Extended stay. That's one way to put it. I checked into room 47 6 months ago and never checked out. Now I'm part of the permanent collection. Dr. Morrison approached my bed. When had I gotten into a bed? And pressed the cold metal of his stethoscope against my chest. The instrument felt like it had been stored in a morgue. And when he listened to my breathing, his expression grew concerned. Significant fluid accumulation, he murmured, making notes on a chart that materialized from nowhere. Stage 4 progression, which is remarkable considering the short exposure time. Mr. Kowalski appears to be particularly susceptible to our facility's therapeutic atmosphere. I tried to sit up, but leather restraints had appeared around my wrists and ankles while I wasn't paying attention. The bed beneath me felt different now. Not modern mattress and box springs, but the thin padding and wire mesh of a hospital bed from 70 years ago. The restraints are for your own safety, the nurse explained, checking the buckles with practiced efficiency. Patients in the advanced stages sometimes try to leave before their treatment is complete. This ensures you receive the full benefit of our medical intervention. Through the window, I could see the sun beginning to rise over Baltimore Street. Golden light crept across the courtyard, illuminating wheelchairs that had been empty for decades and medical equipment that had failed to save the people who'd needed it most. 7 o'clock, Dr. Morrison announced, checking a pocket watch that ran backward. Sunrise check-in is now complete. Mr. Kowalski's reservation has been confirmed for permanent occupancy. My coughing grew worse, each spasm bringing up more blood than the last. The fluid in my lungs made every breath feel like drowning, and I could taste copper and fear on my tongue. The tuberculosis infection that had killed 47 people in 1952 was completing its work through supernatural means, using my healthy lungs as a new host for bacteria that should have been extinct. The wonderful thing about our facility, Dr. Morrison said, preparing a syringe filled with something that looked suspiciously like blood, is that death is just the beginning of employment. Once your respiratory system shuts down completely, you'll join our staff as a permanent night clerk. The hours are flexible, the benefits are eternal, and you'll never have to worry about finding another job. Patterson turned his head toward me, his eyes now showing the glassy sheen of someone whose brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. The rules weren't meant to protect us, Jake. They were meant to select us. 8 rules to test 8 different responses to supernatural stimuli. Mrs. Hamley wasn't hiring night clerks. She was recruiting patients. Mrs. Hamley has been our head nurse since 1951, Dr. Morrison said, injecting whatever was in the syringe directly into my IV line. She's excellent at identifying candidates who will respond well to our treatment protocols. The injection hit my bloodstream like liquid fire, and I could feel my fever spiking to dangerous levels. Sweat began pouring from my skin, soaking the hospital gown I didn't remember putting on. My vision blurred as my body temperature climbed toward the point where proteins begin to break down and organs start failing. Stage 5, the nurse noted with satisfaction. Systemic shutdown, proceeding normally. Patient should achieve final respiratory failure within the next few hours. Outside the window, I could see a familiar Honda Civic pulling into the parking lot. Mrs. Henley climbed out, carrying her purse and a thermos of coffee. ready to begin another day of managing a bed and breakfast that served as a recruiting station for supernatural tuberculosis patients. But she wasn't Mrs. Hemley anymore. In the morning light, I could see her clearly, the same nurse who'd been guiding me toward room 47, still wearing her 1951 uniform, still carrying the clipboard with patient admissions from 7 decades ago. She looked up toward the window of room 47 and waved. "Welcome to the permanent night shift, Mr. Kowalski," she called. "Your employment benefits include eternal job security and comprehensive medical coverage for all respiratory ailments." I tried to call out, to warn her that she was dead and had been dead for 70 years, but my voice produced only a wet wheeze that carried no words. The tuberculosis was winning, and my reservation was confirmed. The fever climbed higher, turning my thoughts into fragments of memory and hallucination. I saw my apartment above DeGidio's Pizza, the divorce papers Lisa had served me at the insurance office, the job posting that had seemed too good to be true. Each memory felt like it belonged to someone else, as if my life before the Farnsworth House Inn had happened to a stranger whose experiences I'd inherited. Dr. Morrison checked his backward-running pocket watch and frowned. "The respiratory failure is progressing slower than expected. Some patients require additional motivation to complete their transition." He reached for a glass jar on the medical cart, filled with a thick, dark liquid that moved like tar mixed with blood. When he unscrewed the lid, the smell of tuberculosis wards from 70 years ago flooded the room, disinfectant, decay, and the particular sweetness of lungs dissolving from within. "Concentrated essence of the original outbreak," he explained, drawing the liquid into a fresh syringe. 47 patients worth of infection, distilled into its purest form. This should accelerate your integration into our permanent staff." Patterson turned his head toward me, his breathing now so shallow it barely registered as life. "Don't let them inject you with that. Once it hits your bloodstream, there's no fighting it anymore. You become part of the building's immune system, protecting it from anyone who might threaten the operation." "Mr. Patterson," the nurse said sharply, "please don't discourage the new employee. Mr. Kowalski signed an employment contract, and we intend to honor its terms." "I never signed anything," I gasped, though talking sent spasms of pain through my chest. The nurse produced a document from her clipboard, yellowed paper covered in handwriting that looked suspiciously like my own. At the bottom, my signature appeared in red ink that hadn't been there moments before. "Employment agreement for night clerk position," she read. "Terms include room and board, health insurance, and permanent job security. Signed by David Jake Kowalski. Dated 6 months in advance of hire date." The signature was definitely mine, down to the way I crossed my J's and the slight leftward slant of my cursive. But I'd never seen the document before, never agreed to permanent employment, and certainly never signed anything in red ink. "Time works differently here," Dr. Morrison said, approaching with the syringe full of concentrated tuberculosis. "Your signature was collected the moment you accepted the position. The infection began the moment you walked through our doors. The dying began the moment you read the rules." He pressed the needle against my IV port. But before he could inject the contents, Patterson did something that surprised everyone in the room. He sat up. After 6 months of respiratory failure, after his lungs had filled with fluid and his body had begun the process of shutting down, Patterson somehow found the strength to pull himself upright in his hospital bed. The motion tore several of his IV lines free, sending medical equipment crashing to the floor. "The rules," he said, his voice stronger than it had been since I'd entered the room. "Jake, the rules aren't meant to protect the guests. They're meant to protect the building from the guests." Dr. Morrison spun around, dropping the syringe in his surprise. "Mr. Patterson, please return to your resting position. Sitting up in your condition could cause permanent damage. I'm already permanently damaged. Patterson laughed, blood spraying from his mouth in a fine mist. But I figured something out during my 6 months in this bed. The rules work both ways. If we're employees now, if we're part of the staff, then we have access to the same systems that created them. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, standing on shaking limbs that hadn't supported weight in months. The nurse rushed toward him, but Patterson held up one hand in a gesture that froze her in place. "Rule number 9, he announced, his voice carrying through the building's ventilation system like an intercom broadcast. All employees have the right to terminate their contracts with 48 hours' notice. The room shuddered around us, walls shifting and buckling as if the building itself was trying to reject Patterson's words. The fluorescent lights flickered rapidly, casting strobing shadows that made everyone look like they were moving in slow motion. "There is no rule number 9, Dr. Morrison protested, but his voice sounded less certain than before. "There is now," Patterson said. "I've been lying in this bed for 6 months, listening to you talk about employment contracts and staff integration. If you want to run this place like a business, then you have to follow employment law." He turned toward me, his eyes bright with fever and determination. "Jake, repeat after me. I hereby give my 48 hours notice of resignation from the Farnsworth House Inn." "I hereby give my 48 hours notice of resignation from the Farnsworth House Inn," I said, though the words came out as a whisper mixed with blood. The building screamed. Not a human scream, but the sound of metal tearing and wood splintering, as if the structure itself was in physical pain. The iron bed frames began to vibrate, rattling against the linoleum floor with increasing intensity. Windows cracked, and plaster fell from the ceiling in chunks that revealed the modern inn's actual construction beneath the supernatural overlay. "Unacceptable," the nurse said, but her professional composure was slipping. "Employee contracts cannot be terminated during active medical treatment." "Then discharge us," Patterson said. "Complete our treatment and release us to outpatient care." Dr. Morrison clutched his medical bag like a security blanket, his face pale with something that might have been fear. "The treatment cannot be completed. The infection is too advanced, too integrated with your biological systems." "Then you're admitting medical malpractice," Patterson said. "Treating patients with incurable conditions without informed consent. That's grounds for immediate license revocation." The supernatural overlay was breaking down rapidly now. The 1951 medical equipment began to flicker in and out of existence, sometimes appearing solid and sometimes revealing the modern furniture underneath. The nurse's uniform shifted between eras, one moment showing the starched white dress of a 1950s hospital worker, the next revealing the casual clothes of a contemporary inn manager. "This isn't how it works," Dr. Morrison said, his voice rising toward panic. "The dead don't get to negotiate their employment terms." "But we're not dead yet," I said, finding strength I didn't know I still possessed. "And if we're employees, then we have rights." I focused all my remaining energy on the leather restraints around my wrists. The buckles felt solid, real in a way that the supernatural elements didn't. When I pulled against them, they began to stretch and give, as if the building's reality was becoming more flexible. Patterson walked to the window and pulled back the curtains, revealing the parking lot where Mrs. Hemley, or whoever she really was, stood next to her Honda Civic. In the morning sunlight, she looked like what she'd always been, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a tired expression, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing a sensible cardigan. "She's not the head nurse from 1951, Patterson said. "She's just Mrs. Hemley, trying to manage a bed and breakfast built on a cursed foundation." The supernatural elements feed on belief, on our acceptance of their version of reality. He pressed his hand against the window glass, and I could see his reflection clearly for the first time. Not the wasted tuberculosis patient from moments before, but a tired man in his 40s, wearing a hotel uniform shirt and khakis. The hospital gown was gone, replaced by the same clothes I'd seen him wearing when they found his body. "The infection is real," he continued, "but it's not tuberculosis. It's something else, something that feeds on isolation and fear, and the willingness to follow rules without questioning their source." I pulled harder against the restraints, and this time they snapped completely. My hands were free, and when I looked down at my body, I saw my own clothes. Jeans and a polo shirt with the Farnsworth House Inn logo, not a hospital gown. The IV line was still in my arm, but instead of medical tubing, it was connected to the building's plumbing system, literally feeding me the sickness that soaked through the walls and floorboards. I yanked the tube free and immediately felt the fever begin to break. "The building needs us to believe in the tuberculosis sanatorium," I said, understanding flooding through me like cold water. "It needs us to accept the role of patients so it can keep feeding on our life force." Dr. Morrison and the nurse were changing too, their professional medical personas dissolving to reveal what they'd always been. Previous night clerks, who'd never learned to question the rules, who'd accepted their roles as patients and become part of the building's digestive system. "Rule number 10, Patterson announced. "All supernatural employment contracts are null and void if the employee discovers the true nature of their working conditions." The room finished its transformation back to normal, a regular in-room with queen bed, writing desk, and reproduction Civil War photographs on the walls. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Henley approaching the front entrance, keys in hand, ready to start another day of running a business she probably didn't realize was feeding on her employees. Patterson looked at me with eyes that were clear and focused for the first time since I'd met him. "Ready to clock out, Jake?" I nodded, though I could still taste blood, and my lungs felt heavy with fluid that shouldn't exist. Outside, Mrs. Henley unlocked the front door and stepped into a lobby that would look perfectly normal to anyone who hadn't spent the night learning that employment contracts could be written in blood and enforced by the dead. Mrs. Henley found us in the lobby at 7:15 a.m., sitting in the wingback chairs near the fireplace like two guests who'd gotten up early for complimentary breakfast. Patterson looked exhausted but alive, and I was coughing up the last traces of whatever infection had tried to claim my lungs during the night. "Jake?" she said, confusion clear in her voice. "What are you doing down here? And who is this gentleman?" "Patterson," he said, extending his hand. "Former night clerk. I've been having some trouble with my final paycheck." Mrs. Henley stared at him like she was seeing a ghost, which wasn't far from the truth. Her face went pale, and she gripped her coffee thermos so tightly I thought the plastic might crack. "That's not possible," she whispered. "You died. We found your body in room 47, and the paramedics said I had tuberculosis bacteria in my lungs that had been extinct for 70 years, Patterson finished. "But medical examiners don't typically test for supernatural employment disputes." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photos I'd taken during the night. Images of the registration book filled with red ink entries, the salt water bowl turned crimson, the scratches carved into room 47's door. In the morning light, reviewing the evidence on my phone screen, even I had trouble believing what had happened. But the photos were real, and so was the taste of blood still lingering in my mouth. "The building has been feeding on night clerks for decades," I explained, "using some kind of supernatural infection to convert employees into permanent patients. Patterson figured out how to break the cycle by treating it like a labor dispute." Mrs. Henley sank into the chair across from us, her thermos forgotten on the coffee table. I hired him 6 months ago. Nice young man. Very reliable. Then one morning I came in and found him dead in room 47, and the police said it was some kind of rare respiratory illness. The building chose him, Patterson said. Same way it chose Jake, same way it probably chose others before me. The job posting, the salary that seems too good to be true, the rules that sound like safety protocols but are actually selection criteria. I don't understand, Mrs. Hemley said. This is just a bed and breakfast. I inherited it from my aunt, renovated it myself, hired staff through normal channels. I handed her the folded paper with the 8 rules, now looking innocent and harmless in the morning sunlight. Where did you get these? She examined them with growing recognition. They were in my aunt's papers when she passed. She said they were house rules for the night staff, part of the building's history. I thought they were just atmospheric. Your aunt knew, Patterson said gently. She probably struggled with the same problem. Employees disappearing, strange incidents during night shifts, guests checking out early with mysterious illnesses. The rules weren't meant to protect people. They were meant to identify which employees were susceptible to whatever's wrong with this place. Mrs. Hemley looked around the lobby as if seeing it for the first time. What am I supposed to do? Close the inn? Tear down the building? No, I said, surprising myself. You hire day shift only. No overnight staff. No guest stays that extend past sunset. Turn it into a daytime operation. Tours, meetings, events that end before dark. And find a priest, Patterson added. Maybe 2 priests. And someone who knows about building consecration. The foundation needs to be cleansed, not just covered with new carpet and fresh paint. Mrs. Hemley nodded slowly, accepting the reality of a situation that shouldn't exist, but clearly did. What about you two? Will you be pressing charges or filing complaints, or... We'll be finding new jobs, I said, preferably ones that don't come with supernatural employment benefits. Patterson stood and straightened his hotel uniform shirt. I should probably return this, he said, then paused. Actually, keep it as evidence, for whatever investigation follows. We walked out together into the Pennsylvania morning, leaving Mrs. Henley to figure out how to explain supernatural tuberculosis to her insurance company. My Honda Civic started on the first try, and as I drove away from Baltimore Street, I could see the Farnsworth House Inn in my rearview mirror, looking like exactly what it was. A renovated Victorian building with no hint of the horrors that waited inside after dark. But I kept driving until it disappeared completely, and I didn't stop until I reached the Pennsylvania state line.